There we go. Now you can stop.
Well, thank you very much, Catherine, for that introduction, and lovely to see so many of you, even if we're not all gathered together as in the past. This is, I think, particularly suitable talk in some ways because the Windsor spent half their life in France, both at a house in Paris and also at their villa in the south of France. And as Catherine said, it's the story really of what happened after the abdication. Most books finish there, but there was another 36 years of the Duke's life, another 50 years of the Duchess's life, which is rarely covered, even in a few pages. But I think it's the most interesting period of their life. And I think by looking at the way they behaved then, it sheds new light, I think, on also the abdication. So perhaps we could have our first slide. I'll just run through quickly the period up to 1936. Brilliant. And our second slide. So this is the Duke, born in 1894, the eldest son of George V. And I think we can see in his upbringing, I think some of the reasons perhaps why he behaved as he did later in life. It was pretty emotionally deprived. His father was a bully. His mother was pretty cold and absent. He really never really grew up. He was a sort of Peter Pan figure. He still later in life wrote to his girlfriends in baby language. And the relationship he eventually had with Wallace was very much that of a child with its mother. Next, please. And this is Wallace, born 2 years later. Again, a very emotionally deprived background, also financially difficult. Her father died when she was very young. And though she came from a very good sort of family, there was very little money. She was reliant on relations for taking her in. And I think this strengthened her belief in later life on the need for both emotional security, but also some sort of financial security. And I think sharpened her elbows in terms of having to make her own way in the world. Next. And here we have him in his garter robes as a young man, a young boy. And next. And we have her as a young child. Next. And this is her first husband, Win Spencer, a pilot who she married when she was 19, partly to escape from her family. He turned out to be a drunken bully and she left him quite quickly. And this is when she went off to China. He'd been posted there. And there are all sorts of stories about what she got up to in China, both as a possible spy for the Americans and also learning all sorts of tricks in the brothels of Shanghai. Next. And this is the Duke on one of his world tours after the First World War. He was being trained for kingship. He was being sent out to thank the Empire for their help during the war. And also he was being kept away from the sort of drawing rooms of London where he was busy seducing married women. He always had affairs with married women. I think he clearly felt safer with them. He was a very charismatic and popular prince. I mean, certain parallels with Prince Harry to this day. Next. And this is probably his longest term girlfriend before he got married, a woman called Frida Dudley Ward, married to a Liberal MP. He was very close to her two daughters here and would give them a pearl each year on their birthdays to build a necklace. But as soon as he met Wallace in 1931, that was the end of any contact with the children. In fact, poor old Frida learnt about the breakup of the relationship when Buckingham Palace refused to put her calls through at the switchboard. So he was a man who was both quite ruthless and also quite weak. Next. And this is another of the girlfriends of the period. He particularly liked the States. He felt much freer in the States. And he had a whole series of affairs when he was over there. Next. And this is Wallace marrying her second husband, Ernest Simpson, half American. He'd been serving the Grenadier Guards during the war. He was a shipbroker. And actually, it was a strong marriage. She began to have an affair with the Duke probably just after their meeting in 1931. But she actually she remained wedded to Simpson emotionally. The Duke was a diversion. He gave her status and attention. But actually, she remained in love with Simpson and continued to write to him even after her marriage to the Duke. Next. And this is someone else that she's supposed to have had an affair with, Ribbentrop, the German ambassador in London. They were supposed to have slept together 17 times, which is why he sent her 17 carnations each day. It's difficult to prove whether there was a relationship or not, but she was certainly very friendly with him. In fact, he'd been sent to London specifically to get close to her and to the Duke. Another agent called Stephanie von Hollenhauer was sent to take a flat in the next door flat to Wallace in Bryanston Court. And the Germans very much targeted the Duke. They saw that he would be a friend of Germany. He had very pro-German views. He spoke fluent German. He believed, he said, in the Führerprinzip. Many of his cousins, German cousins, actually were active and quite senior members of the Nazi Party. So he had a great deal of sympathy for what was going on in Nazi Germany. Indeed, to the extent that officials in Britain began to get worried. He was interfering in what were political matters, the Anglo-German Naval Agreement in 1935. He tried to play down the remilitarization of the Rhineland in 1936. And so there were great worries, even before he came to power, that he would not be a king like his father. And his father was worried. His father had said before he died that my son will ruin himself within a year. And that's in effect what happened, because when George V died, Edward actually only reigned for 324 days. Next. One of the extraordinary things is that George V asked MI5 to bug both Wallace and his son. He was worried about their associates, particularly the Germans, his indiscretion. He was very loose-tongued. When he took red boxes home, he would leave them around for people to see. But one of the things that emerged in the course of this MI5 surveillance and bugging was that both of them were having affairs. At the time, they were also having their relationship. So this was the person that was having an affair, someone called Guy Trundle, who was a car salesman. And the Duke at the time was having an affair with an Austrian princess. So it slightly puts a lie to the fact that this was both a monogamous relationship and one that was based on a pure love.
Sorry, Andrew, to interrupt you. Can I just ask everybody, please, just to mute their microphones? I can hear quite a lot of background noise. So if you've just joined, if you wouldn't mind muting, thank you.
Next, please. And this is where he spent a lot of his time, Fort Belvedere in Windsor Great Park. He would entertain there at weekends, and indeed many of the people coming down would be German officials. So in official circles, they were getting more and more worried as they went through the 1930s about the way that he was becoming very close to the Nazis and the way they were playing him. Next. And this is the funeral of George V in January 1936. You can see him here with two of his brothers. As I say, he saw himself very much as a modernizing king, that he would get rid of a lot of the stuffy ritual, that he would change things. But this, of course, brought him into some sort of clash with particularly royal courtiers who liked things as they were before. So there was this inbuilt tension even before the abdication and even before the arrival of Wallace, and even with the problems with his pro-German views. Next. And this is very interesting. This is when the sort of relationship really became public. This is the October 1936. He's on a cruise in the Adriatic with Wallace. And the foreign papers begin to report on it. In fact, the British didn't really know about the affair properly until literally just before the abdication, December 1936. I mean, there were certainly stories about the divorce in October, but it was all very much covered up. One of the interesting things I found in my research was a comment from Diana Cooper in her diary. Diana Cooper was on this cruise, and she said that Wallace found him extremely boring and didn't really want to spend time with him. So here, there's something that normally happens after you get married, not before. This was signs that this was not actually the perfect relationship that we thought. Next. And this brings us to the beginning of the book in December 1936. He's basically been maneuvered into abdicating. He could easily have had a morganatic marriage, which was in effect what he had. He could have taken the throne and then married Wallace. There were lots and lots of options, but Churchill, who was a great supporter of his, found that he really wasn't prepared to fight to be king. He said that our cock won't fight. And that was true. And I think it's also right that basically Baldwin maneuvered the Duke into to giving up the throne. He got pressure from the Dominion prime ministers, and the king had to get permission from them to marry. And they, of course, refused to give it, as he was head of the Church of England, but also because they'd had reports about how unsuitable Wallis was as a bride. So the book begins here. He goes to Windsor to make this broadcast on the evening of the 11th of December, and then he leaves, has dinner with his family, they part, and he literally goes into exile. The deal on abdication was that he wouldn't come back to Britain for some time. He would let his younger brother Bertie, who had taken on the throne, have time to settle in, and he would basically keep a low profile. Wallis was in France, waiting for her degree absolute to come through. He wasn't allowed to be in the same country, so he went off to Austria. Next. To this place called Ensenfield outside Vienna, owned by the Rothschild family. And there he waited for the decree absolute to come through. He was a very difficult house guest. It was lent to him by the Rothschild family, and he was very rude to them. He allowed them to pick up all the bills. He was on the phone constantly to Wallis. He was a very inconsiderate guest. He would play the accordion and the bagpipes till 3 in the morning. He didn't make himself available at Christmas when there was a big party thrown for him. And so in some ways, many of the selfish traits that were exhibited later in his life were pretty much apparent here. Next. And eventually in the spring, the decree absolute comes through, and he moves to join Wallis at a place called the Chateau de Candé in the Loire, which is open. You can go and visit it. And this had been lent to him by a Franco-American businessman called Charles Beddoes, who'd made his money with time and motion studies. He was not a popular figure in either France or America, but he had a great deal of business in Germany. He was very close to the Nazi leadership. And he sort of leveraged this position, having offered the chateau to the Duke because it had nowhere to go. His family had boycotted the wedding. They wouldn't allow Church of England clergy to conduct the services. He was slightly reliant on Beddoes, and Beddoes basically got his deal by getting the Duke to agree to, in return, to come to Germany on a visit in October. And this, of course, was a great propaganda victory for the Nazis. Anyway, in this picture, you see Herman Rogers, who was a very close friend of Wallis, who gave her away. In fact, she later confessed that she was in love with him all her life. The Duke is beside his best man, a man called Fruity Metcalfe. Dicky Mountbatten had hoped to be best man. The Duke had been his best man. But again, he listened to the royal family, and they had refused anyone really from the close family to attend the wedding. Next. Here's another picture of the wedding party. You'll see Randolph Churchill on the right. And the man sort of 4 in from the left is Reverend Robert Jardine Anderson, who did conduct the wedding. He actually left the Church of England to conduct the service because he felt that the Duke was entitled to a religious service. Next. And this is the Chateau de Candé in the Loire. Some of you may have been there. Next. They go and have their honeymoon at this place called Wasserleonberg in near Vienna again. Strange place to go because the woman who owned it or had lived there previously supposedly killed 6 of her husbands. But there he went, and there he thrashed out the financial settlement with his brother Bertie. The agreement was that he would receive the stipend of the equivalent of a younger brother of the monarch, which was £25,000 a year. But there was a great deal of bitterness when it was discovered that, in fact, he didn't need this money. He'd saved so much money from the Duchy of Lancaster monies as Prince of Wales that he was actually extremely rich. So this was the beginning of, in some ways, the rift in the family, the financial settlement of this period. But it got worse as events developed. Next. And this is Charles Beddoes with his wife Fern. The Duke goes to stay with him in Hungary after his honeymoon, and there they plot this visit to Germany. The Duke is doing it partly to annoy his brother, Bertie, partly because I think he wants to big himself up in front of Wallis to show that he's still a world statesman. He hasn't retired to a private life. And I think he wanted to give Wallis the trappings of being a royal. And the Germans certainly pulled out all the stops for them when they arrived. So there was huge bunting around. They met all the Nazi leadership. They were royally entertained. And of course, this was all free. And of course, this was also terrible publicity. The British government were absolutely appalled when they discovered what was going on. Next. So this is the trip. You can see what looks like possibly a Nazi salute there. Next. So I'm expecting some SS troops. He also went to concentration camp. He had tea with Goering, dinner with Goebbels and Hess, and he, his celebrity was exploited by the Nazis in a way that was very unfortunate. Next. And I think one of the worst things, if you go to the next picture, was he had tea with Hitler. We don't know what he discussed with Hitler because the minutes have never been revealed, but there's some suggestion that they came to some sort of accommodation that if there was war, that the Duke would have some role to play as a puppet king. Next. So they returned to France in October 1937. They take on the lease of this villa in Antibes, now owned by Roman Abramovich, called the Chateau de la Croix. And they spent part of their time there and part of their time at the next picture, which was a house near the Bois de Boulogne in Paris. And they lived very lavishly and extravagantly. They had liveried servants. They entertained twice a week, often 24 for dinner. On one occasion, when there was only 6, the butler expressed surprise, and Wallace said, "Well, they are all kings, though." Next. So this gives you some sense of the sort of luxury in which they live. This is the entrance to the house in Paris. Next. And this is the small dining room. They actually moved from this house because the dining room was too small for them. Next. So this takes us on to the Second World War, and the Duke is keen to play his part. Chamberlain actually sends a plane to pick him up and bring him back on the 3rd of September. The Duke refuses to get into it, partly because he doesn't want to, Wallace is scared of flying, partly because he has so much luggage he wants to bring back that he doesn't want to just go in a plane, and partly because he's holding out for this family to give Wallace the status of Her Royal Highness, which would be denied under the marriage, and also to make sure that the family basically were going to accept them when they came back. So he refused to get on the plane and actually instead asked if they would send a destroyer for him, which is exactly what they did. Poor old Louis Mountbatten came with HMS Kelly, picked them up from Cherbourg and took them back. And when he got to Britain, I think this is a picture outside the War Office, he was offered 2 jobs. One was as a regional commissioner in Wales, and the other was to be the liaison officer to the First French Army. And he picked the first, and George VI decided he didn't want his brother back in Britain, and therefore sent him promptly back to France. Next. So here he is inspecting the French defences. This actually proved to be very fortuitous because the British hadn't had access to the fences, particularly the famous Maginot Line. And so he was very useful as a way to report on defences, to see how bad morale was, how poor the generalship was with the French. And he wrote up this report and gave it to the British. The unfortunate thing is he also passed the report to Charles Beddoes, who was a Nazi agent. And Beddoes passed it on to the ambassador in The Hague. We know this from the documentation we have. And this was passed to the Germans, who then changed their war plans with devastating effect, of course, in May 1940. They realized that they could just go round the side of the Maginot and through the Ardennes. And that's exactly what they did. So we can actually sort of put the blame on the Duke for the betrayal of the French defences and the consequent results with the rapid invasion and surrender of France. Next. The Duke escapes from Paris and is told to leave to go to Spain and Portugal, where he will be picked up by a flying boat and flown back to Britain. But this is when a plan by the Germans is hatched called Operation Willy. They find excuses to keep him in Lisbon, and they begin to conduct negotiations with him that he will come back to Britain as a sort of British Pétain or Gauleiter, should Britain be defeated. And of course, it looks pretty likely. The Germans have swept through France, the expeditionary forces in retreat. And there's an extraordinary moment when the Panzer divisions actually halt at the Nord Canal and let the British expeditionary force escape at Dunkirk. And if you look at actually what's going on in terms of the peace overtures elsewhere, you suddenly get an idea of probably what was happening. This was exactly the period the Duke was negotiating with Germans to come back. Hitler was determined to basically keep his forces intact and turn them on Russia, which is what thought was the real threat, and was very happy to try and do a deal with the British. And negotiations have been going on really throughout the summer of 1940. That was one of the shocking things to discover in the archives, that even people like Churchill were entertaining these approaches through the Vatican, through Sweden, and through Switzerland. And they were certainly being taken seriously by the Foreign Secretary, Lord Halifax. And many of these revolved around some sort of peace deal, with Churchill being deposed, the King, George VI, being sent to Canada, and the Duke returning as the head of this German state. Now, what happens when he gets to Lisbon is he's sent to stay at this house in Cascais, which is just outside, owned by a man called Espírito de Santo, who was a Portuguese banker, but he was also a German agent. The bank actually financed the Nazi party. So again, a very unfortunate person to be connected with, but he'd been directed there because basically the excuse was there were no hotels he could stay in. Next. And here's a picture of him with Espírito de Santo and his wife in the garden. And we know from Portuguese surveillance, Secret Service reports, surveillance reports, that he was in and out of the German embassy. We know from captured German documents after the war that he was basically in league with the Germans, talking to them about how he could serve their interests. And all this stuff, of course, was being passed back to Ribbentrop in Berlin. But it was also being passed back to the British, because what he didn't realize was his police protection officer was reporting to Scotland Yard. There were other members of staff who were reporting on him, and that there were decrypts picking up some of the communications, so that Churchill was well aware of what was going on. Next. And the man in charge of the operation was this SS general called Walter Schellenberg. And he had actually been given large sums of money to give to the Duke to go and wait in Switzerland until he was called to come back to Britain. And Churchill, realizing the danger of the situation, first of all threatened the Duke with court-martial. Of course, all these papers are suppressed in the British archives, but they're copies in archives abroad. Basically, he was being encouraged with financially and through this sort of flattery that there was a role for him. Next. So Churchill eventually realizes that something has to be done very quickly. He sends the man with the glasses here, Walter Monckton, who's a friend of the Duke, who'd been involved in the abdication negotiations. And the Duke is offered the job of the governor of the Bahamas. It's a bit of a come down from being the Emperor of India, but it gets him out of Europe, and they think out of mischief. But in fact, it brings him very close to the American mainland, where he begins to engage with the isolationists and discuss that they shouldn't come into the war. One of the extraordinary things here is he goes by boat to the Bahamas via Bermuda, and en route in Bermuda, he communicates with the Germans. They'd said to him, "Look, you know, clearly the time isn't ready for you to come back now, but we will call on you when you're needed." And he replies in code to the Germans, who are the enemy during wartime, "Yes, when you're ready, call on me, and I'll be there to serve you." In fact, he encourages them to bomb London as the best way to subjugate the British. So this really was an extreme act of treachery, which has been covered up since. Anyway, next picture. He gets to Bahamas, and they've just done up Government House for him at great expense. But even so, he's not very happy with the decor. And even though this is, of course, the height of the Battle of Britain, and that all the money spent on doing redecoration in the Bahamas is money that could have been spent on Spitfires, he gets his way, and he gets his redecoration. He actually threatens he does move out, to live with a man called Harry Oakes, who was a rich landowner in the Bahamas. And next picture, we'll see the decor that he gets. That's a picture of how Government House was decorated. Next. And this is him in the Bahamas. Now, in some ways, it was the making of Wallace. She had some more purpose in life, something to do. She throws herself into charitable works. She serves up bacon and eggs in the canteen at the base. She opens up a clinic for young Black children. And so she is a very effective governor's wife, but he really does nothing much except play golf. He's bored, he's not interested in the job, he feels angry still that he's been sent into exile. He calls the Bahamas Elba. And he is frustrated because much of the government is run either by the Colonial Office in London or by local businessmen known as the Bay Street Boys, who basically control the legislature and the executive. Next. Anyway, the man he goes to stay with is this man called Harry Oakes, who is a tax exile in the Bahamas and is probably the largest landowner on the Bahamas. The two men become very friendly. The Duke feels that he may be a useful ally in his fight against the Bay Street Boys and in trying to improve the lot of the Blacks. The Duke does try to do something initially, at least. Next. But his efforts are frustrated when on the 8th of July 1943 at Oakes's house, Westbourne, Oakes is found, if we go to the next picture, brutally murdered one morning. He is found with a boat hook, I think, has been smashed across his face. His body's been set alight to try and destroy the evidence. Immediately, the Duke orders a blackout. And instead of getting, for example, policemen from the base or calling on Scotland Yard or even going to the FBI in New York, he rather mysteriously asked for two FBI agents from Miami. It turns out that these agents who he's met on his previous trips to the States are actually pretty corrupt. They're in hock to Mayor Lansky and organized crime in Miami. And it turns out that the purpose of this by the Duke is basically to ensure the investigation goes nowhere or is controlled. Even the chief of police, for example, in the Bahamas, who could easily have conducted this investigation, is actually seconded by the Duke immediately to a new job in Trinidad. Next. And what the Duke does, extraordinary, is he basically points the finger at Harry Oakes's son-in-law, a man called Alfred de Marigny, with whom he's been feuding, both Oakes and de Marigny been feuding, but also the Duke and de Marigny about various things. And he basically tries to set him up as a patsy. Next. De Marigny is acquitted in a rather dramatic court case where the defense are able to prove that the evidence against him has actually been manufactured, that the fingerprint on the Chinese silk screen in Oakes's bedroom, which carries de Marigny's fingerprint, has actually been lifted from a glass which has been given to him when he's been offered a drink somewhere else. And so de Marigny is not convicted. In fact, no one has ever been convicted of the offense. But the person who I think most of us think committed it is this man called Harold Christie, later actually knighted for services to the Bahamas. And Christie is a property developer. He's a very close associate of both the Duke and Harry Oakes. But he's been double-crossing Harry Oakes. Harry Oakes has basically withdrawn a lot of his work, or all his work, from Christie. The Duke is involved with Oakes and Christie in investing, or siphoning off money, and there were currency restrictions at this point, siphoning off money to through a Nazi bank called the Banco de Continental to Mexico. And this is what, of course, everyone is trying to keep quiet. Next. It's probably thought that actually two hitmen from Mayor Lansky came in from Miami, murdered Christie, and left that night. In fact, Christie was staying that night at Westbourne. He discovered the body and claimed that he'd heard nothing in the course of the evening. He was also, there were witnesses showing that he had actually been in a car in the middle of Nassau that night, in the middle of the night, with these two hitmen. This was another unfortunate associate of the Duke, a man called Axel Wenner-Gren. He's the founder of Electrolux. He had been a great believer in world peace, and he had been involved in these peace negotiations really in the late 1930s and continuing through into 1940. When the Duke came to the Bahamas, he mysteriously appeared. He bought a huge estate called Shangri-La. Both the Americans and the British were very concerned about what his activities were there. He was building deep water harbors, which they thought were sheltering U-boats refueling from the Caribbean. He had a huge yacht called the Southern Cross he bought from Howard Hughes, which mysteriously turned up to pick up survivors after U-boats had torpedoed various boats. And eventually he was blacklisted. But the Duke, again, was very close to him. He liked basically using the Southern Cross to go to the States and to go on cruises. And he ignored all the warnings from the British and Americans not to associate with Axel Wenner-Gren, who was always known as Goering's pal. He was very close to the Nazi leadership. So here he is, close to Beddoe, a Nazi agent, close to Axel Wenner-Gren, who's also certainly a Nazi sympathizer. So the problems in some ways haven't gone away for the British. Next. And here is a picture of him at work in Government House. There's a rather poignant account in Patrick Skene Catlin's autobiography, and Patrick is still alive, where he meets the Duke on the golf course. The Duke is actually not walking between the holes, he's actually driving between them. And he tells Patrick to get into the car, and he takes him down to one of the townships. And as they drive into the township, a lot of young black boys run out and parade for him, and he basically takes a salute. And there are lots and lots of these stories of him trying to replicate his life as king in his exile. Next. So here's the Duchess in her Red Cross uniform and the Duke at one of the events that he attends. But he's determined to get out of the Bahamas. He actually is offered a job as governor of Bermuda, which he's tempted to accept. But he's lobbying very hard to get a job as some sort of unofficial roving ambassador with the Americans. He's very keen to be close to the Americans. He, in fact, lobbies Roosevelt to stay out of the war. And it's one of the reasons why the British are very keen to keep him out before Roosevelt's re-election in November 1940, and clearly to keep him out before the Americans come into the war in December 41. Next. So at the end of the war, he continues to lobby for jobs, even as an ambassador in South America. Both Attlee and later Churchill refuse him any job. There's a great deal of suspicion of what he's been up to. Of course, they've been following it all through their informers, not only MI5 bugging him, but also the FBI. So there's a lot of material that's collected on his activities and his unfortunate associations. So he decides at the end of the war that he'll spend half his year in France and half in the States. And he takes an apartment here at the Waldorf Astoria in New York, but he also spends a lot of time playing golf in Palm Beach, seeing people in Newport, staying with people on Long Island. Next. And one of the reasons the royal family becomes so bitter against him or angry against him and frees him out is not so much the abdication, but the discovery at the end of the war of what he's been up to, or proof of what he's been up to. Excuse me. And this comes from some captured German documents, basically the correspondence between the German Foreign Ministry and the various embassies, including those in Spain and Portugal. And they spell out in pretty chilling detail the degree of cooperation he was prepared to offer to the Germans. And there's a big fight after the war to suppress these documents. Unfortunately, they've been found in the American zone. The Americans have copies, but Churchill lobbies Eisenhower very hard to destroy them. He says that they're actually forgeries. They can't be taken seriously. These ambassadors have made all this stuff up. And they do manage to basically delay the publication of these war documents, some of which were used at Nuremberg, until 1957, to downplay their significance, in fact, to suppress many of them, like the minutes of the meeting with Hitler in 1937. But we know that they're accurate from two people. One is this man here, Tommy Lascelles, who was the King George VI private secretary, who confirms it in his diary. Next. And also this man, Guy Liddell, looks rather similar, who's an MI5 officer, in fact, the cousin of Tommy Lascelles, who kept a diary which has just been made available in the public archives, and again confirms that the Duke was a traitor during the war. Next. One of the other great mysteries was the purpose of Anthony Blunt's mission at the end of the war to this place called Kronberg in Germany, the home of the Hesse family. Now, Philip of Hesse had been a senior Nazi general. He's a cousin of the Duke, and there were concerns that there was correspondence between the Duke and Philip of Hesse at Kronberg, and that was the reason that Blunt was sent there on the secret mission with Owen Morshead to retrieve this incriminating correspondence. It's always been denied by Buckingham Palace, but I found in the diary of a British officer at Kronberg, Michael David Price at Keble College, Oxford, a diary entry showing that he, just casually walking one day in the library, he had found this correspondence. So I think it's pretty certain that the reason Blunt was sent across was to recover this correspondence, which of course would be very embarrassing, had been revealed. And that was perhaps why he was able to secure his immunity deal when he was uncovered as a Soviet agent some years later. Next. And the next scandal really to affect the Windsors was here at Ednam Lodge in Berkshire. They'd gone to stay with their friend the Earl of Dudley. They'd gone up to the theatre for the evening. For some reason, they'd brought all their jewellery, and instead of putting it in the safe at the house, they'd left it under the bed with the window open. A cat burglar had climbed in, taken the jewellery, most of which was not recovered, and the cat burglar was never ever found, though there have been some suggestions of who it might have been. Anyway, the mystery, they then claimed on the insurance. The mystery was slightly solved after their deaths when at the auction of Wallace's jewellery in Geneva in 1986, many of the items that were supposedly stolen at Ednam Lodge in 1946 were actually up for sale. It seems that they basically carried out an insurance scam. Next. So they return after the war, decide to live in Paris, where they've been given tax exile status. It was a very unequal relationship. The French were extremely good to the Windsors. They had all sorts of perks. They, in fact, provided security for them. But the Windsors hardly, they called them froggies the whole time, the froggy land. They hardly learned to speak French, were always extremely rude about the French. In fact, most of their friends tended to be expatriates living their minor nobility rather than actually the French themselves. Next. And they basically spent their time gardening, playing golf, and entertaining. Here's one of the dinner parties that they held. I think there possibly Clark Gable maybe there, Daniel Zunnick. But it was a pretty aimless life with cafe society. They were very restless, a lot of traveling. And generally, most serious people just ignored them. Next. And this is probably the house that we most associate with them in the Bois de Boulogne, the home that had been lent to Charles de Gaulle at the end of the war. It had originally been the home of Baron Haussmann. And there they carried on this extraordinary, luxurious lifestyle with their servants and very elaborate 8-course dinner parties. There was so much cutlery, sometimes the guests just didn't know which fork to use and mistook some of the plates for ashtrays. Next. And again, the great myth is that this was this great love affair. As I said, the Duke had threatened to commit suicide if Wallace didn't marry him. So she felt emotionally trapped in this relationship, and one of her ways of escape was for the series of affairs, including with this man, Jimmy Donahue, who was the heir to the Walworth fortune, a cousin of Barbara Hutton, who actually was bisexual, but he was young, he was vivacious, he made her feel young. It made, of course, the Duke feel jealous. And that was all part of the power games that she played. In fact, the more unpleasant she was to the Duke, the more he liked it. He enjoyed, in some ways, being dominated by her, and often he would admit to being sent to bed in tears. Diana Cooper has a mention of her telling him to buzz off mosquito. And so there was this extraordinary sort of menage a trois, because what's also emerged in the course of the book is that both Wallace and the Duke were bisexual. And the Duke, according to some people, was also attracted to Jimmy Donahue. That relationship lasted for about 4 years. And if we go to the next page, if you can read it, it's not very clear, but this is the Secret Service report by the French Secret Service reporting on Jimmy Donahue staying overnight at the house in Paris when the Duke is away. And these papers are all available at Vincennes. Next. And this, I think, is a very poignant picture because it sums up really what they've become, which is sort of jokes. Donahue was always picking up the bill, which was part of his attraction, but he also loved teasing them. He tried to convert Wallace to Catholicism and would take the Duke, who of course was the former head of the Church of England, to Catholic services. He was very friendly with the Cardinal Spellman, who was the Cardinal in New York, who was a bit of a cross-dresser. But here they are at a nightclub, El Morocco, at New Year's Eve, 1957, posing in these paper crowns. And this is just a sort of final humiliation of their sort of descent into any sort of lack of dignity. Next. The royal family realized that they had to somehow come to some rapprochement with the Windsors. And so in 1957, the Duke and Wallace were invited to a plaque ceremony for Queen Mary in the Mall. And that was the first time the Queen, indeed the Queen Mother, had met Wallace since 1936. The royal family realized that this didn't play well, this great feud, and that something needed to be done, particularly as the Duke was becoming more and more decrepit, and they realized he may not have long to live. Next. They bought the Windsors this converted mill just outside Paris, about 20 miles outside Paris. In some ways, the happiest times were spent there, often entertaining at the weekend people like Maria Callas and Cecil Beaton, Richard Burton, Elizabeth Taylor, and so who've all left wonderful accounts of going there. We always think of Wallace as this woman with a great deal of style, but I'll let you make your own mind up when you see the next two pictures. Next. That's one room. Next. So it's not the color reproduction. I think she just liked these very, very bright colors. Next. And the Duke, say, really from the late 1950s, became more and more infirm. This is a visit by the Queen in May 1972. They know that he's on his deathbed, and she goes to basically end the feud because they're very concerned about what's going to happen to his papers and to many of the royal memorabilia that he has, things like the Garter robe. But Charles writes in his diary about his visits to the Bois de Boulogne. He was just absolutely shocked, really, by their lifestyle and how strange they were. Next. The Duke dies in May 1972, and though Wallace had not, shall we say, been a loving wife, I think she was traumatized by the death. I think she realized that there was more to him than perhaps met the eye, that she hadn't been perhaps the best wife. But I found a rather chilling story from the night nurse. The myth is that basically the Duke died in her arms, but the reality was that he died in the arms of this night nurse, a woman called Julie Chattard, and that Wallace, whose bedroom was only 2 doors away from his, hadn't once visited him in the 2 weeks before he died, even though she could probably hear him calling for her every evening. Next. So Wallace goes to the service at St. George's, Windsor. Philip and Lord Mountbatten work very closely with her to ensure that basically all this material is returned to the Royal Archives. There's 3 lorry loads is taken away shortly afterwards and is deposited in the Royal Archives, where of course it's never to be seen again. Next. The Duchess lives on another 14 years, but she lives on really as a vegetable. She's very much under the clutches of this French lawyer called Maitre Blum, who cuts her off from her friends and begins to basically filch some of the artifacts and sell them, ostensibly to pay for her medical care. But she's living in one room upstairs with no visitors and basically surviving off a diet of vodka. Next. And she dies in 1986. Here she has a service again at St. George's. And next. And here they are, finally brought together at Frogmore. But she remains without a title, and though the service is deferential, it's certainly not one that's done with any great aplomb. In some ways, this is the end of the problem of the Windsors. Anyway, I realize I've spoken for 50 minutes. I'm very happy to answer any questions. I don't know if those are done by chat or how they're done, or people just speak. But thank you very much for listening. I hope that's been an introduction.
Wow, that's wonderful. Thank you, Andrew, for taking us through their story. It's an astonishing story, shocking and very compelling, but you've really brought it alive for us this afternoon. We are obviously running a bit out of time. So what I'm going to do is I will just, if anybody would like to ask a question, can we ask you to unmute so that we know that you'd like to speak with Andrew, and then you can go ahead and ask your question. So I'm just going to have a quick look down and see if we have
Yes, I can see that Jim, but
yeah.
Jim, you're muted, so you need to unmute.
There we are. Can you hear?
Yeah,
yep.
We can.
I'm sorry we appear to be comatose. We're just relaxing on the sofa. Would love to hear a bit more about the Duke's relationship with Churchill, because Churchill obviously did support him through the abdication crisis, yet by that point, the Duke's association with Nazis and his sympathy with the Third Reich were already known, or at least rumoured. And, you know, I wonder how Churchill reconciled those two things, and, you know, what else you can tell us about that changing relationship between Churchill.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, Churchill had been his great supporter during the abdication for the King's Party, but when he became Prime Minister, he was privy to all these intrigues with the Germans, and his views changed, and he threatened to court-martial him. I mean, he was the one who sent him off to the Bahamas, and refused basically to give him the job. Indeed, after the war, he refused to go on a cruise that Onassis had invited them both on, because he wasn't prepared to be in his company. Where the royal family were unprepared to give the Duke any sort of job at the end of the war, Churchill was prepared to entertain, to try and find something for him, because he thought that at least this would keep him out of trouble. But there was nothing that seemed suitable. But yeah, he was a great romantic who of course was a great monarchist, but he realized that this perhaps was not a monarch he wanted to have anything to do with.
Okay, thank you.
Richard or Val, I'm not sure which it is.
Hi Liz, it's Richard.
Hi Richard.
Andrew, I wondered if you could elaborate a bit on why the French were so, supportive and generous after the war. What were they hoping to get out of that relationship, or his presence in Paris?
Well, I don't know what they hoped to get. I mean, what they did get was that all the monies were left to the Institut Pasteur. So, millions and millions. He'd made lots of money from his investments. And indeed, a lot of the furniture from the house and the porcelain were donated to French museums. So in some ways, he repaid the debt later on. But why they were so generous, I'm not quite sure. I haven't been able to establish that. I think they'd like the idea of having, it was one up for the British, perhaps. It was an opportunity to show off having a monarch in Paris. I mean, he certainly brought a lot of attention to the capital. People came and reported on him there. But unfortunately, the French archives don't reveal this. We've got the Secret Service reports, and in fact, there's a wonderful archive from a now defunct French magazine with lots of wonderful pictures of him, some of which I use in the book. But it's been very difficult to find any sort of commentary from the French about things. There must have been other Secret Service reports for other periods. I found the period immediately after the war, but I suspect they've been weeded.
Andrew, I had a question that's come through to me on WhatsApp. Could you tell us what's going on with the Southampton papers? There was something
Right.
recently in the news about it.
There was, yeah, and thank you, Liz, very much for your sterling work with the switch. The background for those you don't know is that for 6 years I've been fighting to get access to the private diaries and letters of Dickie and Edwina Mountbatten, which I'd hoped to use in my book, but I couldn't use. These have been bought with public funds and an acceptance of lieu scheme for £4.5 million by Southampton University and not made available. And after various basically FOI requests and various campaigns, the Information Commissioner ruled that the Southampton should make them available. This was in 2019, and they appealed, and the hearing is now, they kicked it down the road through COVID and for various other reasons. The hearing is actually being held in a couple of weeks' time. But after I was financing this myself, this campaign, and all the legal fees, I ran out of money in the summer and I had to do a crowdfunding operation, which people were very generous for. We raised the 50,000 needed to take it through to November. And as a result of that, there was a press campaign and indeed a parliamentary campaign with questions in the House of Parliament and an early day motion. And as a result of that pressure, Southampton have now quietly released quite a lot of material, up to about 1960. So there's still another 20 years to go. And there are still some files kept back, some diaries, particularly relating to India and Pakistan. But we're hoping that at this hearing on the 15th of November, they will, all their arguments will be basically destroyed. There are no grounds to hold back this material. And it will be available to scholars to use. So too late for me, but a very useful source along the lines of the Chips Channon's diary for other scholars.
Thanks, Andrew. Kath, I can see Lizanne has unmuted, as has Steve.
Right. Lizanne.
Hello, Andrew. Yeah, did you actually have to get permission from the Crown to publish this? Because you've obviously used archives that were held in elsewhere than in Britain.
No, I certainly wouldn't have got permission to say the things I've said in the book. I accused the Queen's uncle of treachery, and frankly, he should have been executed. People were executed for far less. No, and the only comment from Buckingham Palace with inquiries from the press is no comment. No, I mean, I wasn't able to get into the Royal Archives during the research because of COVID, but I've been allowed in now. Of course, all the material there is weeded, and what's interesting is all the material in the British Archives has been taken out, but there are some mirror files in the Bahamas. So there's material there that I found that was useful. There's clearly material in these French and German and particularly in Portuguese and Spanish archives, and there's quite a lot of material in American archives from various things that he was doing, FBI reports, things like that. So no, it's not a story Buckingham Palace want told. In fact, the government, particularly after the war, were very keen to suppress the story and discredit any association with the Nazis. And no one until now has really joined up the dots to show through documentation that the Duke, rather than being an innocent victim of the Nazis, was actually actively intriguing with them.
Do you think that because of the sort of strong his cousins, etc., do you think he was so deluded that actually he just felt that it was family relations?
Well, I think part of his behaviour was motivated by a personal sort of bitterness and an attempt, I think, to make himself, as I say, a bigger figure on the world stage. So there was a personal element, but I think he did generally believe that we shouldn't go to war with Germany or shouldn't be at war with Germany, because of course he came back even campaigning for peace in January 1940 and was working with Beaverbrook to that end. But he remained a supporter of Hitler. He remained very friendly with Oswald Mosley to the end of his life. He said Hitler was a great chap. He was very anti-Semitic, and the people he mixed with, like Clint Murchison, who'd been involved in the Kennedy assassination, were all very right-wing Americans. He voted for, well, if he could have voted, he would have voted for Barry Goldwater in the elections. So it's what he believed would have been right, and in some ways, maybe he was right. Of course, that the real threat was communism, but it would have meant if he negotiated with Germans as king, or if he brought back as a puppet, we would be living in a very different Britain to this day.
Steve, I think you wanted to ask a question.
He's now muted again, so I'm not sure
muted.
whether that was, yeah, no, I don't see anybody else unmuted, Kath.
Okay, can I ask a question? I'm fascinated by your choice of subject matter, Andrew. Knowing you a little and knowing the kind of person you are, hardworking, unselfish agent who supports your clients very, very well, and yet clearly you're fascinated by these very flawed public figures. And I'm sort of interested to know what that is about, why you're so fascinated by that. And I'd love to know who you have most sympathy with. Is it Edward or is it Wallace at the end of the day?
Well, I have more sympathy, I think, with Wallace, because I think she, and particularly given her efforts during the Second World War, she slightly redeemed herself. I feel very sorry for him. He was rather a sort of pathetic figure. Mm. It is difficult. I mean, you're right. I mean, I did Guy Burgess, who was a spy, and one was able to make him, I hope, sympathetic, because you have to make characters sympathetic or have some sort of empathy with them to understand what motivates them. And I thought he had made a terrific sacrifice by giving up his life, even if it was rather foolishly, to the Soviet Union. The Mountbattens, of course, were more mixed because they clearly had huge achievements to their name, but there was this dark secret at the center of his life, which was his bisexuality and indeed his paedophilia. So these rogue royals always interest me. As you say, flawed people are much more interesting than goody-goodies like John Buchan, who I started with. But there are also people with hidden lives. And I think that's the fascinating thing to try and have in some of these almost parallel narratives. And particularly I'm interested now in the way that these stories are curated often by the subjects themselves and the way that they're covered up by institutions, particularly by the government. Because I work a lot from documents, and often I find those documents denied me for various reasons, that becomes a bit of a challenge, and makes you, of course, keener to find out what they're hiding, basically. But I do have the strong feeling that we're not getting our true history of our country, or I suspect it's true in France as well, because material is destroyed and censored, and we just and people take secrets to the grave.
I've read too that several critics have said that your book is urgent reading for today's royals. And I wonder what kind of messages you would like them to take from this story that you've told.
Well, you're right. I mean, it's another reason I chose it, because clearly after the Crown, everyone knows about the royals and it helps with American rights and things. That's me wearing my agent's hat. But yeah, there are extraordinary parallels between Harry and Meghan and the Windsors. The charismatic prince, not perhaps very bright, rather weak, taken by a much strong-willed American divorcee into exile. The debates over finance and security, the fights with the brother to whom they've been close, with the sisters-in-law, the curation of the story through journalists and writers, the suing of the press for writing anything critical, the exploitation of the royal brand, the private pleasure above public duty. So the playbook is exactly the same, and I think in some ways it's worse because Meghan is much more sophisticated character than Wallace. We live in a less deferential age where things are reported much more quickly, and with social media can be spread very quickly. So I feel very sorry for the royal family, because it's very difficult to know what they can do to rein them in. And there's a lot of dirty linen being washed. I understand that actually one of the things that Harry's going to put in his book next year is material on the Duke and his Nazi associations, which are clearly known in the family. So I don't know what they can do. I mean, the royal family tried to freeze them out, then they had to keep them slightly on board. And they always left the door slightly open. I mean, the Duke did come back and visit his mother, in the way that I suspect Harry will be allowed to come back, probably on his own, diplomatically, to see his own family. And on the basis, I mean, one of the reasons they didn't give Wallace HRH was they thought the marriage wouldn't last and there would be other wives. And I think that must be the feeling now, that this marriage with Harry may not last and he may come back with his tail between his legs.
Fascinating. I don't know if there are any more questions. I have one more that I'd like to ask, but is there anybody else that would like to ask a question?
It's not a question, it's just, I don't think, Andrew, you're going to get invited to any garden parties at Buckingham Palace anytime soon.
No. And if I get invited for investiture with a sword, I'm not going, yeah. No, it has. I mean, it has slightly. I would say I'm a monarchist, but it has made me question the principle of monarchy when you see some of these rogue royals. I think the great thing that was done was Baldwin to maneuver him off the throne, because in some ways we were saved with a far more appropriate king, George VI, than we would have had if he'd been allowed to take his place or to continue as king.
We are getting very close to finishing, but I wondered if you could, you hinted at who you might be writing about next, Andrew, just before we started, which was quite fascinating. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I'd welcome any suggestions. I quite like rogue royals because, again, there's an international market, there's quite a lot of material, there's interesting interplay between the public and the private lives. And the two people that interest me, not that he's a rogue royal really, is Prince Philip. But I think it's probably too soon to do a book on Prince Philip, who had a very interesting life and I think was a very important figure in the 20th century monarchy. But I think while the Queen's alive, I think people will be reluctant to speak openly about, shall we say, his private life. And I think that I have begun to try and uncover official documents which have been closed. There's something like 70 files in the National Archives which are closed. So I'm beginning on that, and then I'm intrigued by Andrew and Fergie. Again, studies of odd marriages, because of course this is it seems they seem closer in divorce than they were when they were married. So, and again, two rogues who get up to mischief are always much more entertaining. So I'm doing quite a lot of work on Andy and Fergie at the moment, particularly on their financial dealings, not so much on the Epstein case, but what they've been, basically how they supported themselves so luxuriously, who's been paying the bills.
Fascinating. Well, I am conscious that we don't have much time left. So is there anybody else that would like to ask one last question?
I'm always, if you just Google me, you can always find ways of contacting me. So I'm always happy to answer anything or to be in contact if you want, or indeed to send you a signed book plate if you buy the book. So do feel you can get in contact.
That's lovely. Well, you've given us so much to think about, Andrew. It's absolutely fascinating. So much to think around as well. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's lovely to see you with us again. I should just mention that next week we are actually going to have our session on a Saturday rather than Friday. And it's Polly Crosby who is going to be talking about her book, The Illustrated Child, a debut novel, which seems very interesting. So thank you for joining us, Andrew. Absolutely fascinating to hear your talk and to see the photographs and to hear your views on the book as well.
Thanks very much.
Thank
Lovely
you.
to see you, and I will look forward to seeing you next year.
Next year in person, we hope.
Next person in Paris, so.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thanks very much, Liz. Yeah. Bye.